Hello, deep learners. I'm Andrew Ng, founder of deeplearning.ai, and I'm excited to welcome you to our global deep learning community. I know that many of you are here today because you want to break into AI and build your career. I hope that being part of this community will help you to do so. To give you a proper welcome, I'd like to show you around the deeplearning.ai offices and meet some of the teams so that you can see where it all happens.
Oh, hi, Andrew.
Do you want to tell our friends at Pine AI what you do at deeplearning.ai?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I make articles and other media that help people learn about AI and help them understand the huge impact that AI is having in the world. Today, I'm putting together the next issue of The Batch, our weekly newsletter, and I'm looking for the biggest stories of the week to keep our readers informed.
What's been the most surprising thing you've run into working on The Batch?
How much is going on in this field? There's never a dull moment. You might think from the outside that machine learning engineers really understand everything about AI, but nobody understands everything about AI because this field is just coming to life right before my eyes as I put this thing together every week.
All right, I know you're really busy, so I'll let you get back to it.
Thanks. See you later.
Let's go meet Kian, who helped me create the deep learning specialization. He's working on an exciting new project. Hey Kian, so do you want to tell the people at Pine AI what you're working on?
Yes, sure. I'm leading a project called Workera, focusing on helping people get offers in AI and navigating their career by testing their skills, preparing for interviews and certifying them, as well as matching and referring them to good jobs in AI.
That's really cool. And what's the most exciting part of your day?
You know, the AI field is new, organizations and jobs are still misunderstood. So I'm excited to help people understand what different types of jobs exist in the field, what tasks they will work on, and what skills are needed to achieve those tasks.
That's really important work. Well, it's nice chatting. And now let's go chat with Hotel, who is on their product team.
Hey, Andrew.
Do you want to say hi to our friends at Pine AI and let them know what you're working on?
I would love to. Hi, everyone. I lead the product team in deeplearning.ai, where we create AI education content accessible to people all around the world. People like you.
And what are you most excited about right now?
I am so excited to see our community grow and to see how eager people are to learn more about AI.
Thanks, Hotel.
Thanks, Andrew.
So, as you can see, our team is working hard to support you and help you learn. It's never been easier than before to break into AI. So if you want to build a career, you can leverage online resources available, including open source code, datasets, papers, and online courses like a deep learning specialization on Coursera. As part of this journey, I hope you get your hands dirty too. Don't be afraid of diving in to build your own project. Or go ahead and try to replicate a research paper that you're excited about. One thing that I've seen help a lot of people succeed is if you can build a community or find a community of fellow deep learners you can meet with and study with on a regular basis. In fact, I hope that this Pine AI meetup that you're at right now will be a good place for you to meet these people. I hope you enjoyed the event today and that you learn a lot, both from the talks and from each other. And once again, welcome to the deeplearning.ai community.
Hello, everyone, and good evening, good afternoon, and perhaps good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Jose Morey. As you guys know me as Dr. Intergalactic. We have a phenomenal show for you tonight. I have a good friend and buddy and phenomenal PhD doctor going to go into Federated Learning. Dr. Colin Compas is here this evening. He's in the house. He's got a very special talk for you. I know this is a very hot topic. Everyone seems to be very interested in this right now. Obviously, coming from a healthcare perspective, I actually did not dress up like this. I just got back from the hospital, but from a healthcare perspective, this is a very big issue, very important issue, particularly around patient privacy. As we know here in the United States, we're very big into data privacy, HIPAA compliance. It's something that needs to be discussed, and ways to solve that problem is something that everyone is really interested in. And it's not just around healthcare data. Obviously, data privacy is something that is hugely important across industries and across domains. So I know this is something that it's going to be very exciting for all of you. But before we get to our main attraction of Dr. Compas, who's going to bring down the house with federated learning, we have to switch over to the person who keeps me sane, my co-host, Fritz Peraza.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Morey. That's a great introduction. I'm really excited for this talk too. I've got a lot to learn about this, and I'm really interested. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Colin Compas. He leads the Healthcare Solutions Architect team in North America for NVIDIA. This team is focused on bringing AI solutions to healthcare. His background is in medical image analysis, where he's worked to develop automated methods for anomaly detection and clinical decision support. Prior to joining NVIDIA, he worked to bring cognitive solutions to radiologists and cardiologists as a part of IBM research. He received his PhD in biomedical engineering from Yale University, focusing on the quantification of cardiac function and echocardiography. His work has resulted in over 25 journal and conference publications. Now, Dr. Compas, I look forward to hearing what you have to say about federated learning.
Well, thank you, Fritz, and thank you, Jose, for the introduction. It's great to be here to talk about this topic that has been of significant interest to everyone that we speak with on a daily basis. So the team that I manage at NVIDIA is a field-facing team. So we work with all of NVIDIA's customers in the healthcare space, and federated learning is always top of mind in many of those discussions these days. So with that, we can go ahead and start the presentation. And my goal here is to give a brief introduction into some of the concepts behind federated learning, the problems that it focuses on solving, showcase a few of the recent results that are showing that this actually can have an impact in practice, and then give a few pointers to some of the tools that we're putting out to help make federated learning workflows accessible to anyone that wants to get started in this area. So all of the recent advancements in AI and deep learning have come about because of a confluence of three different factors. So the availability of large-scale data sets, high-powered compute, especially GPUs provided by companies like NVIDIA, as well as many different advances on the latest algorithms to be able to do deep learning and other machine learning-based approaches to solve the problems that are coming up. And all of this in the healthcare domain is leading to a very rapid amount of innovation that's going on, and it's really now starting to come to fruition and make its way into practice. And for me, that's just the most exciting part of all of this, is starting to see the impact that all of this amazing research can have on actual clinical care and on actual impacts in other areas of healthcare, like accelerated drug discovery. And so the applications for AI in medicine are pretty expansive, from everything around dealing with medical images. And so those could be the traditional radiology domains, such as CT, MRI, X-ray, or pathology or ophthalmology, where the data sets are quite different from what's going on in radiology. But the methods that underlie most of the deep learning-based approaches can be used on any of these types of data. Genetics is another hot topic and another great area where we're seeing a lot of recent advancements. And then as well as dealing with structured data and things like EMRs and other tabular data types that are being acquired about different patients or about other aspects of healthcare. So all of the operations and payers and providers, everyone is looking at different ways to apply this kind of technology. And we're just seeing such an incredible interest. And so on the left here, we have a plot of the deep learning-based submissions to sort of the premier medical imaging conference over the years. And you can see that the percentage of papers that have been leveraging deep learning went from almost none in 2014 to now almost 90% in 2019. We haven't compiled the stats from last year, but you can imagine that it's at least as high as it was the year before. And now this amazing research is starting to make its way into practice. And so this chart on the right is put out online, and it shows all the great places that companies are starting to bring this technology to market through FDA cleared algorithms. And so there's been 29 devices so far with that are actually leveraging AI that have been cleared for practice. Now you can see there's a pretty big difference between all of this research that's going on and what's making its way into practice. 29 algorithms, well, that's great. It's a very small drop in the bucket of what's possible when we look at all of the different ways that AI could start making an impact in clinical practice. And so one of the biggest problems and biggest hurdles that anyone has to overcome in building a robust deep learning model to apply in the healthcare domain is the availability of data. So no matter what, once you define a problem that you want to solve, the first thing you have to do is to figure out what data is available and how can we create a large, robust data set that's going to help us solve that problem. In sort of standard computer vision with, trying to classify objects in natural scene images like you would do in an ImageNet type challenge, it's relatively easy and straightforward to get lots and lots of examples of the type of data that you're looking for. In healthcare, there's obvious limitations around what can and can't be shared, how this data can be aggregated, how representative data from one site is going to be to the population that would be at a different institution. If you were trying to build an AI application for some diagnostic task in radiology, and you have access to data set that's coming from Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, it's going to have a very different patient population that you're pulling from than if you go even to another cancer center like MD Anderson in Texas. Those populations are going to be very different. And the types of deep learning models that you develop may or may not translate well across those different patient populations. And those institutions, despite the fact that they may want to, may not always be able to sort of pool all of that data together to be able to train one common, robust model to solve this particular problem that's going to be of interest to them. And so one of the things that the technologies that's really starting to come about to address this problem is instead of trying to pool the data, you actually can create a method that allows you to train local models on all of the institution's data, pool the actual models themselves, and then update to a global model that is going to take into account all of the information that's coming from each of those institutions and allow the central model to learn from all of the data at these local sites without actually exposing any of that data. And so that is the federated model that we're going to talk about here. And this really comes as sort of a natural progression to how deep learning models have been developed thus far. So in the beginning, the sort of traditional workflow for creating a model is to define your data set, define what your architecture is going to be, ensure that your data set is labeled properly, and then start this training process. And then you evaluate how that model does, and then iteratively feed through this development cycle. After if you want to do that in the beginning and there's no other work in the space, you may have to start from scratch. But what folks have found is that leveraging models that are trained either on a similar domain or even sometimes on a completely different domain as a starting point for doing your model training really improves the results. So there's actually knowledge that gets encoded into these deep learning networks that can be applied across domains. And so then you can do what's called transfer learning to actually adapt that original pre-trained model to the task that you're interested in. And so federated learning, it can be thought of as sort of an extension to transfer learning, where we have a single model that we're all looking to update, but then we're going to be doing that fine-tuning task on each individual data set. Now, the big difference is that then each of those individual models gets aggregated together to help contribute their learned information back to this overall global model that could eventually be deployed. And this is still a relatively new topic. The real concept of federated learning was first formalized by a group at Google in 2017. In 2018, there were 180 publications on the topic. In the first half of last year, there was over 1,000. So you can see that this topic is of great interest to many different folks in many, many different areas. The original work was focused on doing custom text prediction on cell phones so that your data is not actually leaving your phone. But obviously, there's huge benefits in the healthcare domain if we can start to train models without ever having to expose that sensitive or private patient information. And so the way that this works is you have all of your institutions and they've agreed to solve some common problem. You define what that problem is going to be and what the network architecture is that you're going to use to for this particular task. There's then one central server that helps to orchestrate all of the different experiments that are going on at these individual institutions. And so that's going to do both the aggregation and then sort of the distribution of those model weights back to the individual institutions at each iteration of the training process. And so to start, the current state of the model gets pushed out to all of those individual institutions. They all do their local training. They're going to provide their particular data. They're going to update those model weights based on the data set at each of those individual institutions. And then they're going to push those model weights back to the central aggregation server. That federated server is going to combine all of those individual weights. In this case, it's often just a weighted average of the different contributions from each of these institutions that gets then pushed back out to those individual sites, and they then iteratively work through this process. They train again for a few iterations on their own data, push those model weights back up until you start to see this global model converge to a common performance. And through this process, again, the data is never leaving the individual institutions, just the model weights are being pushed back up to the central server. So the data is never exposed. And this really starts to overcome two significant challenges. One is just the sheer volume of data that can be contributed to the development of a single deep learning model. Now, all of those individual institutions that each have 5,000 patients available, now you're training a global model on 15,000 patients. The other big thing that this enables is for a much more robust model to be developed. Now those different institutions at different parts of the country or even different parts of the world can contribute their data to a single model that is going to be much more robust to the overall problem that you're trying to solve. And we'll show some of the results of what this is actually enabling in some of our initial applications. And so at its core, this is a learning paradigm that trains collaboratively without having to centralize data sets. And we'll show that this allows models to still obtain the same level of performance that you would get if you were able to actually pool all of those individual data sets into a single common place. This really focuses on addressing privacy and governance concerns, especially in areas with sensitive data. There's a lot of new opportunities that this can open up, both with large-scale institutions being able to validate other models, creating models where no single institution has enough data available to actually develop something specific to that particular condition. And then again, the privacy is maintained throughout this entire process. And we have a very large team within NVIDIA who's been working on this problem with our various collaborators, both in other parts of industry as well as in academia. And these folks range from solution architects like myself who have backgrounds within the medical space. We have applied researchers, we have engineers that are actually building the tools that are going into the products that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And then all of the different sites that we work with who are both innovating on the research side, as well as contributing the data and the clinical knowledge that goes into creating and orchestrating these different projects. So I want to talk about a few examples of where we're starting to see this really make an impact in practice. So we have two different areas that NVIDIA is directly involved with. So we have clinical collaborators, largely in the US, but now expanding worldwide, who are focused on image-based tasks for mostly in the radiology domain. Another big collaboration that is getting underway out of the UK is what's called the Melody Project. And so this is taking that same technology that we've just sort of described, this federated learning platform, and applying it to a very different type of problem. So accelerated drug discovery is obviously on everybody's mind right now, and we keep hearing about all of the challenges that the pharmaceutical industry is up against whenever they want to bring a new drug to market. And so this collaboration is an effort by some of these large industry as well as national partners to accelerate that process, to actually share data to kind of contribute to a common goal without having to expose any of their private IP or their own private data that they hold sort of near and dear. And this really shows that the potential for this technology goes beyond just the research domain. Now we're enabling, direct competitors in a highly competitive and regulated space to be able to work together to contribute towards common goals to solve the problems that we're facing right now in the healthcare space. Now, one of the challenges in any kind of deep learning approach is the possibility of data leakage through the actual models that are being generated. And there's a lot of research about sort of adversarial attacks or other mechanisms to actually back out what the underlying training samples used to create that model were. And so that is obviously a big concern if not only are we working to preserve all the individual institutions' data, but then also to create a model that could be distributed more broadly. And so our applied research team sort of extended even some of these original federated learning ideas further to enable a mechanism for differential privacy. And the way that this works is at each of those model update steps, the individual institutions don't actually send up all of their the weights within their individual models. So you can actually have a parameter that will send up some portion of the model weights that are at each individual institution. So 80, 70% of the model weights get passed up each time. This is done in a random fashion with each iteration. This way, the whole model from each institution is never actually sent to the central federated server, and therefore the individual samples can't actually be backed out from the model that's being developed across these institutions. There's also another layer of protection that can be put in by injecting noise on top of those model weights. And again, this all helps to preserve the underlying privacy of the data that's being used to contribute to this overall model. And as an example of the types of performance that we can see, so this was using the privacy preserving method that I just mentioned on a brain tumor segmentation task. And you can see this is a relatively small data set, but it was sort of a proof of concept that this really does work. And so with this data, training the model on a centralized training data set, so taking those 242 subjects and pooling the data, training the deep learning model, and then calculating our DICE score, which is a typical evaluation metric used in medical imaging, and then comparing that to the model that is trained in a distributed fashion using federated averaging, you can see that the model performs just as well. It takes slightly longer to converge, but the end result is the same for the two methods of training this model. And so this really shows that this is something that is possible on real medical imaging data, and that we can then start to roll out more broadly. And so that's what we've been focused on, is working with different partners in both research and as well as in clinical settings to actually solve some of these problems. So another area that we worked on is in the mammography space and being able to do breast density classification. And one of the big challenges is that the data distribution and the intensity distribution of these different data sets can be very, very different depending on where they're acquired and with what scanners they're acquired. And if you try to train a single model at one of those sites, it's not going to perform very well at another site. And so on the right here, we can see the distribution of the intensity data of those individual images trained from 4 different sites. And you can see these are very, very different. And so if you train a model at site 1 and then try to take that to site 3, where the characteristics of that image data set are not going to match what it was trained on, the model is going to perform very, very poorly. This has been a common criticism of a lot of the models that are being developed right now in research, that they don't translate well, that you can publish a paper based on one training set and it looks like you have amazing results. But then when you actually take that out into the field, it doesn't perform nearly as well as you would expect based on the sort of initial results. And so this really helps to overcome those hurdles by actually being able to train a model on a wide distribution of data sets. And so to actually evaluate what this looks like in practice, there's a lot going on in this chart, a lot of numbers, a lot of boxes, but what we're looking at sort of on the y-axis here is the performance of the models trained on the individual institutions' data, and then how well they translate to the other institutions. And so this is a metric that the evaluation metric here is used to identify how well the model performance agrees with an expert radiologist in their breast density calculation. And so the higher the number, the better in this case. It's a range that goes from -1 to 1, 1 being perfect agreement, -1 being no complete disagreement. And so we can see that what you would expect in the sort of top 4 rows and the top 4 columns, when institution 1 trains its model and evaluates on institution 1's data, it performs better than when you take that same model and take it out to the other institutions. You can also see that the model trained at institution 1 does not generalize well to the other institutions. So at 2, you're doing okay. 3 and 4, it does terrible. And this pattern is repeated at the other institutions as well. And so then we can look at how well does this model perform if we centrally host all of that individual data. And you can see that in the 5th row there, that it does well. It does as well as all of the individual models are doing on their individual data sets. But that obviously has big constraints. And in most project settings, it's going to be not possible to do that. No multiple institutions are going to pool all of their data to allow it to be trained in this fashion. And so that's where federated learning comes in. And you can see from the bottom row here that model performs just as well as the centralized server data. And in some cases, it actually does better. And so the latest application that our group has focused on is in the COVID-19 space. And so we sort of took that work that was done in the mammography space one step further, obviously on a problem that is on top of everybody's mind and very prevalent, and anything to do with COVID right now. This is a global problem. And so building a model in the US wouldn't necessarily help in any other parts of the world. And so this was an effort that we undertook to be able to train a single model for predicting whether or not a patient was going to need additional oxygen upon entering an emergency room. The model took as inputs both a chest x-ray image as well as some of the EHR data, some of the other structured measurements that were being acquired about that particular patient, and then does that prediction. And so this work was able to be done with 20 different institutions across the world. So in the US, Canada, Japan, Taiwan, UK, Thailand, Brazil, and Korea all contributed to this single model without any of those data sets ever being shared between all the different institutions. And this was all done in 2 weeks. And I'll talk a bit about the tools that we've put together to actually make this happen. This work is under review right now, but we do have a blog that's out on our healthcare website that goes through some of the details that went into this project. So once you've decided that you have a problem that you want to solve and that you want to be able to apply some of these methods for, what are some of the technical considerations that you need to go through? The first is how you want to handle these privacy and security constraints. And some of this depends both on how trustworthy you feel the other participants in your project are, and then what the final end result of that model is going to be, how you want to be able to distribute that after the fact. The second is how you want to actually do the individual training. How do you want to pool the different weights that are being contributed? How do you want to distribute those back? And then another thing that I didn't touch on here, but there may be instances where that global model actually doesn't perform as well as some of the local models at those individual institutions. And that's not unexpected. If you have a model that is really tailored to your patient population and you have reason to believe that the data set that you have internally is large enough to capture, the future cases that you think you're going to see, then it may make sense to have something that's slightly more tailored to your individual institution. And so part of the workflow could then be that final stage of a fine-tuning step. And so that was sort of the middle bucket when I talked about the 3 stages of deep learning model development. You could do a fine-tuning iteration on top of the final central model and tailor that a little bit more specifically to your institution's data so that the performance is a little bit better. In our experience, we've seen in some instances that does help, and you actually have a model that performs better on the individual institution's data. In other instances, it doesn't. But it really kind of depends on how you see the model being used long term. Another big challenge with this, and I'm not going to say that we have the full answer to this one yet, is about traceability and accountability, and sort of what happens to that data or that model after the fact. If you want to take this all the way through a regulatory process, I don't know that there's a clearly defined avenue to do that at this point. You can, as long as you're maintaining all of the information about the data set that this is trained on, it's going to be okay. There's not a lot of differences then in terms of a federated model versus a centrally trained model. But the obvious implications here are, you could have partners that are coming and going in collaboration. You could have the model that is being updated over time because now it's easy to continue to add new data as more becomes available. You could start with 10 institutions and then after a year have another 10 more that are waiting to join. How does that all get handled from a regulatory perspective? That's still kind of being worked out. And then the last is just what are the actual underlying hardware and software architectures that you're going to use to deliver and do this actual individual training. And so that's an area that we're heavily focused on building the tools to enable that. And our overall, our broader healthcare team has really been focused on contributing to this area. So some of our team hosts a workshop every year at MICI, which is the Medical Imaging Computing and Computer-Aided Intervention Conference. That's really sort of a premier research venue for this kind of work. We've contributed to journal positioning papers as well as some of the individual study papers that I mentioned. But even if we can show that this works great from a research perspective, how do we actually enable that? And so that's where we've been spending a lot of our engineering efforts, is actually building out the tools to enable these kind of workflows. And so at NVIDIA, we have an effort that we call Clara, and this is our sort of healthcare platform for all things AI. And within that, we have a federated learning module. And so this allows all of these institutions to contribute to and develop a single federated model without having to worry about the underlying nuts and bolts of how do we actually communicate these weight updates? How do we do that securely? How do we stand up a central server? How do we stand up all the individual institutions? How do we actually run and distribute these models being pushed in and out of the federated server to these individual institutions? It's a very complicated engineering problem, and so that's why we've been focused on trying to solve that. And all of this obviously runs on top of the hardware platform that we provide, but all the software that we've developed in this space is either open source or freely available online. So we really want institutions to be able to pick this up and run with it. And to focus on trying to lower the barrier to entry for folks getting into this space, we have very detailed Jupyter notebooks that are out on GitHub that anybody can look at to figure out, how do I get started on one of these projects? What do the individual steps look like? What does it look like at the administration level? What does it look like at the individual institution level? All of the details needed to get up and running on this. And this is what enabled our COVID exam project to be able to kick off and complete in 2 weeks. It was having all of these tools and all this common infrastructure already built, and then be able to take that out and quickly deploy at all of the individual institutions to allow them to contribute to this overall application. Some of the domains that we have these pre-trained models and workflows already implemented within the Clara framework are the ones that I've touched on here. So brain tumor segmentation, mammography. I didn't actually touch on pancreas segmentation, but that's another, and then the COVID chest X-ray work. And the easiest place to find all of this is NVIDIA's NGC. So this is our online repository for all things deep learning and AI coming out of NVIDIA, as well as many of our partners. And so the website is there, ngc.nvidia.com. If you go on there and search for Clara, you'll be able to find all of the different resources necessary to get started with solving one of these problems. There's many other tools beyond just federated learning. There's tools for AI-assisted annotation, accelerated deep learning training. We have a whole deployment platform. So once you have this model, how do you actually take that out and integrate it into your clinical system? So we focused on many different aspects of these different workflows and the problems that we see in this space. But you know, this was just one component that gets packaged up into this overall solution. And so, you know, from the content that I've gone through, you know, I just want to highlight a few pieces here that I think, you know, really are the key takeaways. That federated learning allows for collaborative and secure collaboration on a single deep learning based model. The methods are domain agnostic, so they don't necessarily require imaging data. That's just where, you know, we've chosen to focus. There are many possibilities beyond that. There's many other areas of healthcare that contain sensitive data that the Melody project is looking at, things in the drug discovery space. And so obviously the characteristics of those data sets are very, very different than what we have in radiology. But the underlying mechanism is still the same for doing that federated process. It's distributed and very flexible. And then it allows for continuous innovation in this space to solve problems that wouldn't otherwise be possible. So we're really excited about the direction of all of this. I hope that some of these tools could be of value to other folks that want to get started in this space. And I'd love to kind of just open it up for discussion and answer any questions that folks may have. So thank you.
That was amazing, Dr. Compas. That was amazing. We'll get to the questions from the audience in a second. And Fritz, why don't you start priming some of those, please? But from your perspective, Colin, let's go to the security question first. You know, this increase, one of the main things about this was increasing privacy. I'll have to, not like there we go, that's better. Increasing privacy. But is there a way? Is this the solution that we've been waiting for privacy? Is there any way to kind of crack the privacy that federated learning gives you?
I'm not going to say that this is the be all end all, because there certainly could be new ways that somebody could come up with a different type of adversarial attack or something like that. But this really does keep all of the individual data sets private. Now, this sort of workflow of training a single model with these individual weight updates coming from different institutions, and and some of these other methods that I mentioned to actually protect the underlying samples, that is very powerful in space. But this is also something that could benefit from any other areas of differential privacy within deep learning. So there's a ton of other research that is actively going on to solve for other types of adversarial attacks. All of that could be built into a deep learning workflow to help address some of the same kind of problems that are coming up, whether the model is trained centrally or in a federated fashion. So the federated process does not exclude any of that other research and active areas of interest to solving those kind of problems.
That's awesome. Fritz.
All right, let's take a question from the audience. I'll do Erica's question. Would this be available for students that are starting to go into medical school?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, all of the software is freely distributed, either through NGC or through the examples that we have out on GitHub. So yes, to anybody that is interested, it'll run on any NVIDIA GPU. The nice thing about federated learning is that the actual compute requirement at each of the individual institutions is a little bit lower than if you're trying to train a single model. So, the aggregate amount of compute needed is similar, but at each individual institution, they may not have to have as much. All of this runs natively on every major cloud provider. We've actually found that to be a really powerful way to actually run these different projects. Having that central federated server sitting on a cloud instance is a great way to actually manage all of these different workflows. Then most of the local sites will maintain some kind of data center or some kind of data infrastructure internally, and then that will connect up to this cloud instance to aggregate all of the different weights. But then the individual institutions don't need they don't need a supercomputer to get started in this space.
One question I have, Dr. Compas, is what's NVIDIA's role? I mean, for the audience, Colin and I met when we were at IBM Research. But what is NVIDIA's end goal for what they're doing in medicine? Are they looking to develop their own algorithms? Or are they just looking to do hardware, software? Because you guys are doing a lot of research with big institutions. So what is your strategy of what role does NVIDIA play in this industry?
Yeah, our goal is to solve problems that we're uniquely capable of solving. And the reason that we're involved in this space is that it does require our hardware to train these algorithms underneath it. And so if we can then take that and build tools to enable the broader community on top of it, that just accelerates the adoption of all of these techniques. Now, from the software side, we want to just be able to make those, lower that barrier to entry for anybody that wants to get started in this space. The best way to do that is to collaborate with researchers. And so we've had researchers both in-house and then through external collaborators to help us, understand what are the technical challenges that if we can overcome them, it's going to make such a big impact for everybody else that's trying to work in this space. And so that's why we both do research as well as contribute on the software side. We're not going to be, creating, or we have no plans anytime soon to take an algorithm through like FDA clearance or anything like that. All of the stuff that we put out is for research purposes. But we do work with industrial organizations and other companies that may be interested in sort of building on top of this and taking this through that last mile to actually create a clinical product that could be deployed out in the field. And so, yeah, there's a lot of opportunities for that. But right now, we're just really focused on how do we help solve these common problems that we see across the board. We work with customers around the world, and we see these same common challenges come up over and over again. And for us, that means we need to try to focus on that and solve this problem, because if we do, it can have a very significant impact.
Awesome. Let's do Joe's question. If the system was available worldwide this time last year, do you think that we as humanity would have been able to slow down the spread of COVID?
That's a really interesting question. I would love to say yes, absolutely. I think we've seen that even just having the ability to test and things like that hasn't always been the only blocker to identifying disease. But I do think that if there was the ability of everybody internationally to contribute to a single problem-solving mechanism, we could have an impact. And that's obviously the hope of everything that we're doing. I wish that, deep learning was the solution to all the problems that we have right now. That's not the case either. And so, this is only one aspect of the overall problem challenges that we face in this space. But I absolutely think that there's huge potential for this, and just being able to capture the variety of appearances of this kind of disease from all these different populations everywhere in the world. The impacts of that are just enormous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So building off of that, Joe had his other question of how it works on a global level, which I think could work with what we were talking about COVID and everything, of just because, as you said, like certain locations might work better than others. And do you think it would have a lot to do with, as you said, with like tweaking it at the end based on like personal geographical details and things like that? Like, what do you think? How useful would this be on like a global scale due to like having to make those kinds of edits?
Yeah, absolutely. I really like this suggestion of somebody like the WHO getting involved. And, that is the role that NVIDIA had to play in this project. We had to be the one to help get all of these different collaborators to the table to help understand, here's the problem that we're trying to solve. We understand that you have data that is going to help address that, or they heard through some of their other collaborators that we were looking and starting a project in this space. So we had to sort of be that central organization to help create all of these different connections. Some of them were already aware of each other. They were already talking about doing this kind of work in the clinical community. And the particular model that we trained in this case was actually developed at MGB by a researcher there, Mass General Brigham Hospital. And so he had already done some of the initial development of this model, but they knew that their patient population wasn't going to represent enough diversity to create something that could really make a significant impact worldwide. And so that's why they said, okay, we have this starting point. Let's now take this out in a federated fashion and train it around the world. And so that's the real power of this is once you have an idea of a problem that could be solved, actually being able to do it in a real robust and scalable way.
We have another question coming up here in a second. Oh, there it is. What about security? This is from Selathuri, I believe. What about security and proprietary ownership of the AI model sent to the local data sources for training?
Yeah, so from a security perspective, all of the data is secured by the individual institutions. And, we talked about some of the techniques to ensure that there's no data leakage, there's no ability to back out the training samples. So from that standpoint, I think, we're feeling like the area is moving in a great direction. The ownership of the model is a very a good one. And, I think that is one of the bigger challenges right now. If for example, a company wants to host or drive one of these efforts, how do they monetize that for the individual contributors to that model? I don't think there's a good answer to it yet. I mean, you could think about models where it's some revenue sharing based on the amount of data contributed by each institution, or something like that. But I think that there's still some open questions on that front. What is the right way to actually maintain ownership of something that is contributed to by many different parties. And this is true in many other areas of research as well. And so, it's not necessarily a totally unique problem, but it is a complicated one.
I have a personal question I'd like to ask that I was just curious about. I like work in an ER, and a lot of times doctors will talk about how slow changes are to be made from when they're discovered, and they're like, wow, like this is awesome, like this is going to change so many things, and then like nothing happens for like 10 years. And AI is such a fast moving field. So I was wondering kind of how do you think that's going to affect healthcare, because it is kind of slow to adapt to changes, and how is that going to work, I guess, together?
Yeah, I think there's a few different things that have to go into it. One is just sort of building the trust in the algorithms that are coming out, that this is, actually something that is going to add benefit, that is performing at a level that we would expect, in something that's going to be deployed in clinical practice. And then a big part of it is integrating that into current workflows that clinicians are already leveraging. And so that is not an easy task, and that is something that we're focused a lot on the deployment side of the efforts that we have going on. And so that's how, if we get a result back from one of these kind of models, how do we get that into the tool that the clinician is already using in a meaningful way? So those are some of the problems that we have to overcome, and that there's a lot of folks, not only NVIDIA, that are working on trying to solve this. But I think if we've seen anything during the COVID time, is that everybody is now realizing how critical it is to be able to accelerate all of the efforts that are going on in this space. When you look at the timelines of normal vaccine development versus what just happened in this last year, it's unprecedented. And I think that is a momentum that we certainly hope is going to continue and extend to other parts of healthcare, that everyone is realizing there needs to be change. There needs to be the ability to adapt quickly to these kind of problems that are going to come up. And so I hope that this is, a driver for positive change. And if there's anything that, we can do to help drive that forward, I think that's the biggest potential for impact.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Morey.
No, one second, Fritz. I think what you're talking about for COVID specifically, Colin, I think we have a little bit of an Easter egg at the end for everybody about a special AI project with COVID that we're gonna showcase here. But to your point about working with workflows as a physician, I think it's a really strong point. I think we've seen a lot of large and small companies fail because of that. Not really considering or understanding really the industry that they're going into and really the culture of medicine, both in the US and abroad. And I think that's a very important point for any startups or other companies that are out there, is really getting to know and to understand how the payer system works, how the workflow works, what the culture of the institutions are. And it's something that I think a lot of people tend to overlook. They just try to make cool tech, but they don't take into consideration their end users or how it works into the system. And if no matter how cool it is, if it's more onerous, then people aren't going to use it. If it makes them have to do 20 extra steps just because it's a cool piece of technology.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fritz, go ahead, buddy.
I was going to ask, when you were talking about kind of all of the things that you're currently working on, I was wondering if there was like another sector in healthcare that you were like, oh, I would love to see how federated learning would work in that sector. Because you talked about imaging, you talked about drug development. I was just curious to see what you had thought about.
Yeah, drug development is definitely another sort of very big area that I think is just super exciting. I think what's happening in that space is sort of a coming together of traditional high performance computing methods that have been used to do sort of drug discovery and all of the different steps within a drug development pipeline are now being enhanced and enabled by AI. And so I think that's just a really exciting area right now that everybody's seeing, the need to accelerate. Another big area, especially in healthcare, but across the board right now, is in natural language processing. And so being able to actually, understand unstructured text. And so in the healthcare space, that could be, radiology reports, it could be insights coming from scientific journals, things like that. And so, like I said, the federated learning methods are agnostic to the underlying data type. So you could use the same overall mechanisms for text data, for drug discovery data, as well as the imaging data. And so the possibilities are really endless. It's just anywhere that we don't want to expose individual sites' data, this kind of technology could help enable those kind of workflows. And so all of the areas, basically every type of healthcare data is protected in one way or another. And so this is a technology that could make an impact there.
Mm-hmm.
Colin, you talked about the difficulty around FDA approval for something like this. In general, it's something I've thought about just for AI applications, not just in healthcare, but AI applications in general, specifically because of potential biases and potential inappropriate function or systemic inequalities that sometimes can be, put into systems just because of the data. But has there been a thought or discussion, or what are your thoughts on having a completely different process for AI approval, for FDA approval for AI applications in healthcare? And I mean, using the traditional mechanisms that we have, the system wasn't built for the type of technology that we're trying to get approved now. So perhaps it's not really the technology that needs to be fixed, but actually the process that needs to be fixed.
Yeah. And when we think about sort of the systems that are being deployed into hospitals and how those are treated from a regulatory perspective. So, like an MR scanner, and you have the scanner itself, you have the hardware, you have then the software that sits on top of that, and all of that is packaged together. All of that goes through a regulatory filing. When you want to make changes to that, it can be a very cumbersome process. None of that sort of fits with the possibilities of AI. I think one of the really interesting and sort of exciting areas is the notion of software as a medical device. And so how do you actually sort of decouple the compute that's going on the data from a device that's out in a hospital from what you're actually doing with that underlying data? And so I think it does require a different approach. I think that the FDA has put out a few position papers to try to solicit feedback from the broader community on how to improve this process. But I think that there's so many possibilities here that it probably will require some changes to how this process is done. But that's another area of opportunity is building the tools that enable researchers or companies to actually get their algorithms through FDA more quickly. It's the same process for everybody. So anything that we can do to help facilitate and provide the requisite provenance data or performance data or whatever else is needed to take that algorithm through the FDA clearance, that's an opportunity in and of itself. So creating a common set of tools that at the end of your algorithm development, you have everything needed to take that through the regulatory process, that in and of itself could help accelerate some of this.
All right, so we have time for just one more question. This one is from Denise Jackson. What happens if the main server gets hacked?
Yeah, that I think that's going to be a challenge with any kind of computing, whether the server is sort of central or local. The good thing in this case is if the central server is what gets hacked, all somebody would have access to is the underlying model weights. Because the data is never actually exposed, they're not really going to get very much. I mean, I guess they get your deep learning model, which maybe if you had sort of IP concerns around that, it might be a problem. And that actually has been something that's been raised by some of the commercial partners that we work with is, just how do we protect this model? But that's not unique to federated learning. That's going to be true anywhere. In this particular case, the actual sensitive data is still maintained at the individual site. So even if that central server gets hacked, you're not actually exposing anything that would cause a big problem.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Compas. Dr. Morey?
Thank you again, Colin. This has been phenomenal, and everybody out there, thank you for joining us. Obviously there's really exciting things going on in AI, both in medicine and in others, but what I'm most excited about is hopefully AI will someday be able to transport Fritz's hair over to my head. And that would be, I think, the eureka moment that we really all are waiting for. But I promised you guys there would be a special surprise here at the end. Dr. Compas kind of teased it up a little bit about the way AI kind of shaped the whole fight against COVID. And there was actually a project that I worked on with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, as well as Kaggle. And we actually were able to create or be part of a documentary that Relativity is putting out and On the Merits is putting out. So I would like for you guys to see the trailer. The whole movie is coming out March 3rd. It drops online. You'll be able to see it. It's about 20 minutes long. It'll be on YouTube, Vimeo, and Facebook for free. So please, all of you, go catch it. And without further ado, this is the trailer.
Time is critical. I mean, this was in early mid-March. The impact of the virus was largely unknown.
The longer time it takes to be able to diagnose something appropriately and treat it appropriately can have long-standing ramifications.
Everyone really wanted to feel as if they were empowered to do something.
I'm not a doctor, I'm not in healthcare. It wasn't obvious what I could really do. And then this call to action for analytics, for data science came.
We're creating AI tools that are able to start parsing through the large amounts of data that a normal human could never go through and find relationships that we didn't even know existed.
AI can empower physicians all over the world to give the same amount of care to everyone, regardless of where they were born, regardless of their socioeconomic status. That's always been the promise of AI. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks all.